Hello, this is a talk about scientific writing that I was asked to prepare for a conference whose stated goal was to inspire and educate scientists from a broad range of disciplines with the hope of increasing overall happiness in the scientific community. But this isn't possible because in science there's only so much happiness to go around. Either your referee is happy because they're dismantling your paper, or you're happy because your scientific reputation has survived another day. This is the premise of defensive scientific writing, a matter I hope to educate you about today, and there's nothing exciting or inspiring about this topic. My interest in scientific writing began several years ago when I realized that it could be used to divert undue attention from my science. I'd just finished a paper in which I'd said something about Stokes's law and a particle of a certain girth. And this seemingly unremarkable statement had a remarkable effect upon the review process. The referee became very confused and asked what we meant by girth. This was in fact the only question in their report, which ended shortly thereafter, and rejection was swift and merciful. While some might consider this a setback, it could be worse. The article lives out a quietly comfortable existence in the lower tiers of the scientific literature, avoiding the undue scrutiny which comes with being read. As a practitioner of statistical mechanics, and what one of my colleagues presumably affectionately refers to as comically simple models, such scrutiny is often best avoided. On those rare occasions I've succeeded in making my meaning plain to the reader, the response has ranged from polite indifference to incredulity, with consequent harm to my scientific reputation. Faced with such skepticism, it's tempting to conclude, therefore, that science is a terrifying labyrinth within which lurk skeptical referees, dubious thesis examiners, and hostile editors. Help is at hand, though, in the form of defensive scientific writing. This is a set of principles designed to protect, obscure is such an ugly word, your science. Its premise is that if the reader is forced to divert energy from understanding the scientific content of your work to deciphering your writing, your scientific reputation may survive unscathed. Admittedly, defensive scientific writing is the linguistic equivalent of watching one of Jose Mourinho's football teams protect a narrow lead for 90 minutes, but that's the point. Nobody wants to endure that kind of thing. Those of you who practice more legitimate forms of scientific inquiry may not need to resort to such tactics, but it can't hurt to know about them. Before we begin, it's worth noting what not to do, and these are approaches we'll return to throughout the talk. George Orwell in 1946 wrote an essay, Politics and the English Language, in which he discussed writing. The phrase Orwellian has come to mean an attitude of misinformation, propaganda, or denial of truth. But what this essay revealed was that more disturbingly, Orwell was actually a proponent of clear and precise writing, exactly the kind of writing that offers little protection for your science. Almost as bad, an article published in 1990 by George Gopin and Judith Swan, in which they explained how best to structure your sentences to allow the reader to extract your key ideas. This mistake, of course, one that a defensive writer would never make. So we'll begin simply by noting that one should never use a short word where a long and intimidating one will do. So this rule is elementary and always useful. And scientists, especially those who know several fields worth of jargon, are well placed to exploit the principle underlying this rule. If it sounds impressive, it probably is. Don't undersell what you did. Your method should become your methodology, or better, your methodological approach. And that these mean different things is a bonus, so while the referee is working out whether you meant method or set of methods, or making an oblique reference to the branch of logic dealing with the general principles of the formation of knowledge, the precise details of your approach may evade scrutiny, useful for the reasons stated previously. Other gems in widespread use. Nowadays, we don't need to build nanoparticles when we can architecture them. We don't need to use a theory when we could leverage it, and a working study should probably become an in operando study. And this brings us to Latin words, because as Orwell correctly noted, Latin and Greek words are grander than their Saxon equivalents. And so you should consider diverting attention from the details of your calculation by testing your reader's Latin preparation. Other good words are ones Orwell refers to as meaningless, a bit harsh maybe, flexible, better for our purposes. And he says, in the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It's almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we're praising it, and consequently the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it's a democracy, and fear that they might have to stop using the word if it were tied down to any one meaning. In science, we have ready-made alternatives to drop neatly in place. Consider also words like this if you've run out of other things to say about your work. So the best proponents of this principle use words to befuddle a reader the way a plane uses chaff to confuse a missile. So such strategies work best when incorporated within a broader strategy for protecting your science. And we can infer from the literature that information is more likely to escape undue attention if it's placed where the reader least expects to find it. To discuss this idea, we can consider a passage taken from the scientific literature, shown here. And I don't mean to imply that this is a particularly good or bad piece of writing, it just strikes me as a fairly standard piece of scientific text. So it reads, "These observations, taken together with the bright and long-lived photoluminescence, the difficulty of electron tunneling through the inorganic shells and insulating ligands used here, previous claims by others, and consistency between experimental observations and numerical simulations, strongly suggest that excitonic energy transfer and not free charge carrier motion is responsible for exciton transport in our samples." So the end of the sentence is what the authors at the top of the page refer to as the stress position. And they say, it's linguistic commonplace that readers naturally emphasize the material that arrives at the end of a sentence. We refer to that location as a stress position. If a writer is consciously aware of this tendency, she can arrange for the emphatic information to appear at the moment the reader is naturally exerting the greatest reading emphasis. As a result, the chance is greatly increased that reader and writer will perceive the same material as being worthy of primary emphasis. The very structure of the sentence thus helps persuade the reader of the relative values of the sentence's contents. At the other end of the sentence, we have what those authors refer to as the topic position. They say, the information that begins a sentence establishes for the reader a perspective for viewing the sentence as a unit. Readers expect a unit of discourse to be a story about whoever shows up first. So the information you put at the start of a sentence sets the context for what comes next. In the topic position, the reader needs and expects perspective and content. So the topic position should usually contain some old material or material familiar to the reader. In some sense, the topic position sets a scene to be concluded at the end of a sentence. So those authors say, the inclination to direct more energy to that which arrives last in the sentence seems to correspond to the way we work at tasks through time. We tend to take something like a mental breath as we begin to read each new sentence, thereby summoning the tension with which we pay attention to the unfolding of the syntax. As we recognize that the sentence is drawing towards its conclusion, we begin to exhale that mental breath, and this produces a sense of emphasis. In between topic and stress positions comes what could be termed an interruption. So the reader's expectation stems from the pressing need for syntactic resolution, fulfilled only by the arrival of the verb. In this case, either strongly suggest or is responsible for. Without the verb, we don't know what the subject's doing or what the sentence is all about. As a result, the reader focuses attention on the arrival of the verb and resists recognizing anything in the interrupting material as being of primary importance. The longer the interruption lasts, the more likely it becomes that the interruptive material actually contains important information, but its structural location will continue to brand it merely as an interruption. Knowing this, of course, the cunning defensive writer now knows where to hide information undeserving of scrutiny. In other words, the defensive writer is not naive. They don't hand the opposition the tools of their own destruction over and over and over again. They protect themselves and they protect their science. The defensive writer has other tools in their toolbox. They know, for instance, that the passive voice is always to be preferred over the active, gives the impression that your work's been sanctioned by a higher authority, or at the very least some of your peers. So writing something like this, for instance, is a bad idea, because if it's coming from the likes of me, well, who's going to believe that? Certainly not any referee that I've encountered. But written in this way might slow the reader down a fraction. They might spend some time working out who else thinks along similar lines. If you work with mathematics, the defensive writer knows to number only the equations that you refer to, leaving the others unnumbered. That way it's more difficult for the referee to work out what's wrong in the intervening material. Liberal use of words like obvious let the reader know that you're not to be trifled with, and consider replacing nothing at all with your favourite double negative. And finally, if you're a theoretical physicist, the phrase highly non-trivial should appear at least once in your writing. Remember, protect your science. Every reader of your work is potentially hostile, be they referee, external examiner, or colleague looking to crush, or even worse, generalize your work. If you use the principles of defensive writing, you too may one day write a paper about which nobody can think of anything bad to say. Protect your science, make the reader work, give nothing for free. You had to work hard to understand the science, so too should the reader. And always remember the final rule: just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. You've been warned.